You've held this object thousands of times and it never once asked for your attention. That's not an accident. That's the crime scene. This cheap plastic pen, the one abandoned in drawers, chewed in classrooms, lost without regret, quietly did something no weapon, machine, or invention ever managed to do. It rewired the planet. Since 1950, over 100 billion of these pens have been sold. Not distributed, not admired, sold. Every single day, millions more enter circulation, moving through schools, hospitals, prisons, offices, refugee camps, places where words decide who eats, who works, who walks free. And yet, the design never changed. No upgrades, no rebrand, no version 2. In an economy addicted to novelty, this object reached the end of improvement and stopped. That should make you uncomfortable, because progress doesn't usually freeze unless something went very right or very wrong. Before this pen existed, writing was slow, expensive, unreliable, and quietly exclusionary. Knowledge didn't flow. It leaked, smeared, and failed. Most people couldn't afford to write their own name consistently, let alone their future. This pen didn't just fix a tool. It removed a barrier. And once that barrier disappeared, nothing else stayed the same. To understand how that happened, we need to rewind to a time when writing itself was a controlled substance. Long before this pen made writing invisible, writing was a physical ordeal. It demanded patience, money, and tolerance for failure. Quills scratched paper, splintered under pressure, and had to be dipped every few words, turning thought into interruption. Ink pooled, bled, stained hands and documents alike. Writing wasn't a flow, it was a negotiation. Fountain pens promised salvation, but delivered another trap. Their metal nibs caught fibers, their ink flooded unpredictably, and their price tags quietly enforced who was allowed to write and who wasn't. Adjusted for today, a decent pen could cost over $100. That wasn't a tool, that was a gate. And gates shape history. In the early 20th century, literacy wasn't limited by intelligence or desire, it was limited by friction. Every form, letter, and signature demanded equipment that failed often and punished mistakes permanently. One spill could ruin a document. One slip could end a job. Writing carried anxiety, not freedom. And that anxiety scaled. Schools rationed supplies. Offices guarded ink. Entire populations learned to associate writing with risk, mess, and embarrassment. This wasn't accidental. Technologies don't just enable behavior, they filter it. When tools are fragile, only the confident use them. When tools are expensive, only the privileged practice. By the time engineers began chasing the idea of a pen that could write cleanly, consistently, and cheaply, the damage was already embedded in society. Knowledge moved slowly. Records were incomplete. Bureaucracy favored those who could afford reliability. The world didn't need a better pen for artists or executives. It needed a pen that could survive pressure, angle, speed, clumsiness, human reality. But solving that problem would prove far more brutal than anyone expected, because the next idea looked perfect on paper and failed catastrophically in real life again and again and again. The solution seemed obvious. Replace the fragile nib with a ball, a tiny sphere rolling ink onto paper, self-cleaning, self-regulating, immune to angle and pressure. On diagrams, it was flawless. In reality, it was a mechanical nightmare. The ball had to sit in a socket smaller than a grain of sand, free enough to spin, tight enough to seal. Too tight and nothing moved. Ink starved. Lines vanished mid-word. Too loose and the pen bled like a wound, smearing documents, staining pockets, destroying trust. There was no middle ground. Microns decided success or failure, and manufacturing at that precision simply didn't exist at scale. Every prototype worked for a minute, sometimes an hour, then betrayed its owner at the worst possible moment. Engineers blamed tolerances. Manufacturers blamed materials. Users blamed themselves. The idea survived, but the product didn't. For decades, ballpoint pens were infamous, unreliable, scratchy, disposable in the worst sense of the word. They could mark wood, leather, cardboard, anything except paper, the one surface that mattered. Paper fibers grabbed the ball, halted rotation, tore lines apart. Gravity made things worse. Tilt the pen wrong and ink refused to feed. Tilt it another way and it flooded. The promise was consistency. The reality was chaos. The ballpoint became a cautionary tale, a perfect concept trapped inside an impossible system. And that's where most inventions die. Not because they're wrong, but because the world isn't ready to build them. Failure piled up quietly, each attempt leaving another scar on paper, until investors, schools, and buyers learned to expect disappointment every single time. Everyone kept attacking the mechanism: tighter sockets, harder steel, finer machining. Each fix chased the same ghost and missed the same truth. The problem wasn't the ball, it was what everyone was forcing through it. Thin, water-based ink behaved like a liability under pressure. It relied on gravity, soaked into paper fibers, dried slowly, and punished hesitation. Change the writing angle and flow collapsed. Stop moving, and it pooled. The system demanded perfect behavior from imperfect humans. Engineers kept polishing metal while the real failures sloshed inside the tube. When ink is wrong, physics turns hostile. Surface tension pulls it backward, paper drinks it sideways, air replaces it violently. No tolerance stack can save a fluid that refuses to cooperate. The breakthrough came from a simple, uncomfortable question. What if the ink is the enemy? Thicker, oil-based ink changed the rules. It didn't bleed. It dried fast. It sat on top of paper instead of drowning it. Most importantly, it didn't need gravity to move. At microscopic gaps, fluids don't flow the way intuition says they should. Adhesion beats weight. Capillaries pull upward. Flip the system and ink climbs where it's needed. Suddenly, the ball wasn't pushing ink out. Ink was being pulled in, coating the sphere, sealing when idle, feeding when moving. No springs, no pumps, just physics, inverted. Capillary action isn't magic. It's pressure choosing sides. In narrow spaces, liquids cling harder to walls than to themselves, crawling against gravity until weight finally wins. Flip that logic inside a pen tip and something violent happens. Order. The oil-based ink wedges into microscopic channels around the ball, pulled forward by adhesion, not pushed by force. Every rotation drags a fresh skin of ink into position. Every pause lets surface tension snap shut like a valve. There is no pump to jam, no spring to fatigue, no angle to fail. Physics runs the operation continuously, silently, whether the pen is upright, sideways, or upside down in a pocket. What used to be chaos collapses into inevitability. But this elegance came with a price, and it nearly killed the idea. Oil-based ink solved flow, but exposed manufacturing to a new brutality. The ball had to be perfect, round within fractions of 1/1000th of an inch. The socket had to match without choking movement. Any deviation broke the spell. Early versions worked briefly, then seized, leaked, or failed under real hands. Mass production amplified error. Millions of tiny mistakes became millions of angry users. The physics was correct. The world was not. To survive, the system needed precision cheap enough to repeat endlessly. Not craftsmanship, not care, repetition. Factories had to hit tolerances once reserved for watchmakers and do it millions of times a day. Only then did the violence stop. When ink, steel, and plastic finally agreed, the pen crossed a line no invention crosses lightly. It stopped demanding attention. It stopped punishing mistakes. It stopped reminding users that writing was fragile. From that moment on, the technology disappeared, leaving only the act. And when a tool vanishes like that, history tends to move through it, quietly, permanently, without witnesses or applause. By the time the pen finally worked, it failed in a different way. It was too expensive to matter. The physics was flawless, the line was clean, the promise was real, and almost no one could afford it. Early ballpoints sold for prices that, in today's money, hovered around $100 or more. That wasn't democratization. That was a luxury curiosity. The people who needed reliable writing the most were the least likely to touch it. Schools couldn't buy them. Offices rationed them. Workers stuck with tools that leaked and blamed themselves when documents failed. This is where inventions quietly die. Not in laboratories, but in pricing meetings. A technology can be correct and still be irrelevant. It can solve the problem and still miss the moment. The pen sat there, superior, useless, waiting for a system ruthless enough to strip it down. No sentiment, no pride, no romance. Just a question that sounded almost immoral. How cheap can this be made without breaking the physics? Until someone answered that, the breakthrough remained locked behind glass, admired by engineers, ignored by history. The crime wasn't that the pen didn't work. The crime was that it worked only for the few. The turning point wasn't an invention. It was a decision. Someone looked at this pen, not as a marvel, not as a craft object, but as a system to be brutalized by scale. Precision would no longer be a luxury. It would be mandatory and cheap. The gamble was industrial, not intellectual. Steel balls once made slowly for instruments and bearings were now demanded by the millions, identical down to tolerances most factories had never chased. Plastic replaced metal, not because it was elegant, but because it forgave nothing and cost less. Every unnecessary gram was cut, every motion removed. The pen was redesigned to survive factories, shipping crates, heat, cold, pressure, neglect. This wasn't optimization, it was an assault on cost. Machines ran without sympathy. Defects were not fixed, they were eliminated by volume. If one process failed, it was replaced, not refined. The goal wasn't to make a better pen. It was to make the same pen endlessly, predictably, without human judgment. This is where most products collapse. Scale exposes weakness, but here, scale sharpened the design. The hexagonal barrel wasn't aesthetic. It stopped rolling on desks. Transparent plastic wasn't decorative. It eliminated doubt. A tiny vent hole wasn't a flaw. It prevented vacuum lock. Even the cap served double duty, absorbing impact and clipping onto fabric like a restraint. Nothing existed without justification. The price fell fast, then faster. Suddenly, writing didn't require permission. Offices stopped rationing. Schools stopped guarding supplies. Pens became disposable in the best possible way, replaceable, reliable, everywhere. This wasn't innovation as spectacle. It was innovation as infrastructure, quiet, repeatable, indifferent to praise. And once the machines were tuned, there was no going back. The system locked itself in place, producing millions a day, flooding the world with a tool that no longer announced itself. It simply worked. What emerged from that process wasn't elegance in the artistic sense. It was restraint under pressure. The pen didn't try to express identity or status. It refused personality entirely. Every surface, angle, and material existed to answer a specific failure that had already happened somewhere, sometime, to someone. The hexagonal barrel locked fingers into control without asking. The transparent body removed the anxiety of running dry mid-sentence. The steel ball sealed itself when idle, opened only when motion demanded it. Even the ink was tuned to misbehave less than its predecessors, thick enough to stay put, thin enough to move without hesitation. There were no backup systems, no redundancies, no forgiveness. If any part failed, the pen failed, and yet it rarely did. That's the tension at the core of this design. Extreme simplicity backed by zero tolerance for error. It looks fragile. It isn't. It looks cheap. It survives. This is not the kind of object people praise because praise implies alternatives. Here, there are none. Remove anything, and the system collapses. Add anything, and it becomes weaker. The pen doesn't invite admiration. It demands acceptance. And once accepted, it fades into the background, doing the most dangerous thing a technology can do, making itself invisible while shaping behavior at scale. The real impact didn't arrive with fanfare. It arrived quietly, and that's why it worked. When writing tools stop failing, behavior changes. People stop hesitating. They stop rationing words. Forms get filled out completely. Notes get taken without fear of ruining the page. Mistakes become survivable. That shift doesn't look dramatic on camera, but it rewires institutions. Schools no longer treat writing supplies as fragile resources. Offices stop guarding pens like inventory. Bureaucracy accelerates. Records become denser, more accurate, harder to erase. This pen didn't teach anyone how to read or write. It did something far more dangerous. It removed the friction that kept people from trying. Literacy doesn't rise because inspiration strikes. It rises because the tools stop punishing beginners. When a pen is cheap, reliable, and everywhere, the barrier to participation collapses. Contracts get signed, tests get taken, complaints get written. The pen didn't create equality. It exposed how much inequality had been hiding inside broken tools. Once the bottleneck vanished, the volume came through. And when information starts moving freely, institutions either adapt or fracture. That's not progress as a slogan. That's progress as pressure. Efficient ones reveal it. So the next time you hold something that feels ordinary, ask a harder question. What behavior does this make effortless? And who benefits when it disappears into daily life? If this story changed the way you see the objects around you, hit like, share it with someone who still thinks design is just aesthetics, and subscribe for more investigations into the quiet technologies that shape our world.